Hey everyone, let's talk about how we can add a second pair of eyes to our tests with visual testing. So, who am I? I'm Colby Fayok. I'm the one hugging BB-8 and Kylo Ren over there. I work with the dev community as a developer advocate for Outlet Tools. You can find me pretty much anywhere on the web by just Googling my name, as I'm the only one in the world. Let's start off by bringing out Danny Tanner. Who remembers America's Funniest Home Videos? I'm pretty sure every country had something similar, much like the Got Talent series, but instead of playing funniest videos, we're going to look at some UI gone wrong. First, we have DoorDash. I would imagine a lot of us are familiar with this at that point, at least in the US, or some of its competitors like Uber Eats. Given we're in the middle of a pandemic and nobody wants to leave their house, it's a way to get delivery from places that don't typically offer it, like McDonald's? How is McDonald's a local favorite? Anyways, here's a visual bug that was found its way into their order experience. While stylistically, everything looks great, can't help to notice that order estimation time. If I'm hungry, I'd worry a little bit about that estimation. Or Safeway, a regional supermarket here in the US, who has a pharmacy wing, which is something a bit more important than a DoorDash delivery. If I'm trying to sign up to get my flu shot or COVID vaccine, or whatever type of prescription, if I need to be able to fill out that form, overlapping inputs are going to give you a hard time. Depending on the positioning, you may not even be able to do so. Maybe you can tab your way through with your iOS keyboard, but are non technical people going to realize that they can even do that? And be sure that the info itself is right? Or how about WebEx, remote meeting software? This one's a little bit more of just an annoyance, but if I'm trying to unsubscribe from a newsletter, I feel a little bit unsettled with a form looking like this. Companies already go out of their way to try to prevent people from leaving. Is that the case here, or is this just simply a bug? Is this form even going to work? And finally, Amazon. We all know what Amazon is. And while I admittedly buy way too much off of Amazon, they make it really easy. This is a good way from keeping me from buying something. Who am I kidding? I'd probably spin up DevTools and fix this just to buy it, but most people wouldn't. And those are missed sales for Amazon. Maybe one or two don't matter, but at Amazon's scale, if everyone's getting the same experience, that's a lot of missed sales. This isn't meant to shame any of those companies or developers. Bugs happen to everyone. If you look at the attendee above your name in the audience list and look at the attendee below, chances are that one of you have written a bug within the last week. And that's totally okay. No one's pointing fingers, and no one should be pointing fingers. What we should be trying to do is figure out how we can work to prevent those bugs in the first place, which is why we're here to talk about a better way to write tests. Something that's going to be reliable and make sure that your customers are seeing what they should. But let's set up some context a little bit. What do I exactly mean by testing? Well, given that we're at a React conference, it might be obvious that we're talking about software testing, but there are quite a variety of types of tests. Like the test pyramid from Martin Fowler, that includes the UI, service, and unit testing. The UI are typically the broader tests that cover a wider range of functionality like end to end tests, but are generally slower and cost more money. Service tests are focused around a specific part of an application. Maybe that's authentication or payments, but would test functionality around that. Where unit tests are small, extremely focused tests that end up being fast to run and cheap to make because of their size. Or the test trophy from Kent Dodds, where he argues we're at a point where our tooling has helped push us past the limitations of cost and speed. We can now focus on more broad integration tests, which test how different parts of the application work together, like an API and a UI. They're more impactful, where unit tests will still test for important things like business logic. It might not be as impactful if you're spending a lot of time on it. He also adds static, which includes things like linting, which helps prevent bugs in its own right. But regardless of the name that you give them, they're all testing pretty similar things, and they have different characteristics that help them prove to be more or less effective than others. It's important to have a mix of them to make sure that you're covering a wide coverage of the project. Now, typically, I hear a yawn in the back of the room when I start talking about testing, but it's an absolutely critical part of our job as developers. So let's take a quick look why. Starting from the top down, we have our CEO. While sometimes you have a really good hands on CEO, often they report to the board and care mostly about the bottom line. They want to make sure that their business is thriving. How do you do that? Well, by making sure your product doesn't go down. Testing helps build confidence that you're not going to lose money, as well as keeping customers and stakeholders happy. The project or product manager is typically responsible for building that confidence. The development work funnels through them. They need to set those priorities. Adding testing helps the PMs know that they're going to continue to deliver a quality product and keep the CEO happy. While I'd argue that everyone on the team should care about UX, it's literally in the UX team's title. They're focused on how to make the application usable for the people that are using it. By adding tests, they're focused on making sure the customers aren't hitting regressions that provide a bad experience. They also want to make sure that their hard work and intentional design decisions aren't getting pulled off. The developers are the ones who ultimately write the code. While writing tests isn't as fun as building a new feature, they're responsible for making sure that the code doesn't have bugs. It's also hard to be sure that someone down the line will understand that code. Making an accidental change that breaks things, like adding tests, help build confidence in that code. If something breaks, the test will hopefully catch it. And not having to deal with those eventual bugs ends up leaving more time for fun feature development. And it's a common misconception that automated tests replace manual testers, and that's absolutely not true. Even the best testing software doesn't replace a human going through an application and trying to break things. It also doesn't replace a human prioritizing the areas that need work on testing coverage in the first place, and implementing the tools that will actually help make those tests work. Automated tests are just another tool in a tester's belt, helping them and the team build more confidence. It seems like all stakeholders in a project should be on board with tests, but getting good test coverage isn't always as easy as just add tests. So, what makes it so hard? Well, whether you have one giant end to end test or 100 unit tests, all of those tests take time to write. They also require a lot of code. That code, just like features, needs to be maintained. That code, like feature code, might have bugs and increase in complexity. Tests can easily lead to technical debt and end up frustrating developers when broken and left untouched. And speaking of those broken tests, they're often fragile. They depend on hard coded IDs or super specific selectors where one little change and that test can be broken. I may or may not have accidentally removed an ID for testing and broke a test before, but as a new developer where the testing wasn't actually integrated into the development workflow, I really didn't know any better. But the thing is, those things happen, but they end up breaking your tests. So you're thinking it, I'm thinking it. The time you're spending on the tests is time that you can't build new features. For developers, it's usually not as fun. I know that, but it's just as important to keep existing features working as it is to actually build the new ones. Otherwise, you're spending more time refactoring that old code, trying to get it working again, which can be even less fun after a bug prevents your customer from actually shopping. But like this guy out in the mountains, we're probably all thinking the same thing. There's got to be a better way. And before you go spend a weekend out in the mountains just to think about your tests, spoilers, it's visual testing. So let's look at an example of what I mean. Back to DoorDash, instead of writing a bunch of code to assert each of those text elements, making sure that with the order I place that we have the exact values for that estimation, not to mention every other element that needs to be tested on the page, that requires time to write all that code, which can be very fragile. I want an easy way where I can see what's changed on the page, where whenever changes get pushed out, I get test failures like I did before without having to write code for every little detail on the page while still being able to pinpoint those issues. If I have my scripts set up to go through Safeway's screening form, it's going to think everything's fine because those forms are still there, and from a robot's perspective, it's usable. But we're not robots. I need to be able to identify that. And with a huge website, we might not have time or resources to go through every single page manually, not to mention on every single device. Same goes for WebEx and Amazon's quantity selection. We need to be able to test these things the way that we as humans are using it. We need to literally give our tests a second pair of eyes. And this is where Applitools comes in. Applitools is an automated visual testing platform, powered by AI, might I add, that automatically ensures that you're maintaining a high level of quality in your apps. By running Applitools eyes on your project, you're using real images that show what the users of your website or app are actually seeing. This is critical, where a broken image might not show up in a failed test or an unusable form like before. But by using visual testing, you can make sure you're catching all user-facing bugs. But part of what makes Applitools awesome is not only that it's checking for differences, but it's powered by AI. To show a really quick example of how this actually works, let's play Spot the Difference. How many can you find? I'll give you a few seconds. All right, I found three. We have the little hat logo, we have what's on the plate, ketchup on the top of the bottle. Let's see how these visual testing actually picks this up. Eesh, that's not looking too good. I thought visual testing was the savior, right? And that's absolutely not helpful. Well, you probably couldn't tell, but these pictures were off by a little bit of a few pixels, meaning that the entire image ends up being different in the eyes of a pixel by pixel comparison. This is how a lot of the visual testing platforms actually work. They're only smart enough to see a pixel by pixel change, which isn't, in this case, isn't helpful at all. Now, flipping on the switch of Appletool's API, while it seems like it's still highlighting a bit more than it should, we're looking at a completely different picture. Maybe some of the other elements in this picture were a bit messed up through compression. Regardless, we're still getting a lot of false positives. But it's a night and day difference from before. But wait, there's more. With Applitools, we can even take that a step further and hide anything that's changed due to the displacement or the shifting around of the picture. It's smart enough to know that the elements were the same, but they just shifted a little bit, which is incredibly helpful for websites that might render a pixel difference, because that's just how the web is sometimes, right? But now we can clearly spot the difference between these two photos. And looks like I was right. We have our hat, our logo, or our logo hat, a plate, and the top of the bottle. I can even zoom in right inside of the dashboard and I can see exactly what's going on. And while the spot the difference is a lot of fun, this is even more helpful in the context of the web, where between our two login forms, we might not have been able to catch that a broken image or alignment issues with code scripts, but we're able to spot those differences with Applitools. Not to mention, we can run those tests on a variety of different devices. Like here, we're checking it out in both desktop Safari and Chrome on an iPhone. That's right, really easy cross browser testing. So let's break down how this works for a second. Applitools supports a wide variety of SDKs, from web-based testing frameworks like Cypress and Selenium to native platforms like Appium and Espresso. Whatever testing framework you're using, Applitools likely supports and will help you get immediately productive. Let's use Cypress as an example here, where as devs, we're probably at least familiar with the name Cypress. The way it works is first we'll install the SDK into our project straight from npm. We then call that SDK to capture a snapshot. Once that happens, the SDK will extract the snapshot of the DOM, or the document object model, which is the underlying tree of elements inside of our browser. Then upload that snapshot up to Applitools, and then with those snapshots, Applitool will use its visual grid, and depending on your configuration for browsers, to actually generate those screenshots. Where finally, Applitool's eyes will use machine learning to compare those images and intelligently look for differences, where it will then show those differences right in the UI like we saw before. So to do this, you can use the Applitools Eyes Cypress SDK. It's an NPM package. That makes it easy to install right inside of your existing project. And to see how this all works, let's run through a quick demo of adding Applitools to some existing Cypress tests. So here's what we're going to go through. We're going to start off with a simple existing project that I set up ahead of time. We're going to first review that project. We're also going to review the Cypress test that I had already set up. Then we're going to go through and install Applitools for our visual testing. We'll finally add some tests and then run those tests. So let's dig in. All right, we're going to get started with this really simple demo application where we're looking at a login form where if we enter in a username and password, we can see that we're going to get taken to this demo dashboard, which is showing some financial overviews where we can see some balances here and we even have some transactions. But really the goal of this page and demo page is really just to prove for a good way for us to automate some tests in order to test this stuff out. So if we go back over to the login page, we have two things that we primarily want to test. First of all, we want to make sure that when we go to demo.appletools.com, that we're actually going to hit this login page. To do that, we're going to load up this page and we're going to make sure that we see this login form text here. And that means that it's going to load successfully and we're on the right page. Now, the second thing we want to do is we want to try to log into this form. And we can do that just like we did before. We're going to automate being able to fill in this username and password, clicking the button, and then we're going to check and see that this financial overview text is here to make sure that we're actually on that dashboard page. Now, in order to automate those tests, we're going to use Cypress, which, if you're not familiar, it's an end-to-end testing platform based on JavaScript, where we can write scripts to really automate anything we would expect a user to do within our website or application. So for instance, if we load up this page, we can really go through and automate doing things like clicking buttons, we can fill out forms, really anything that you would typically expect somebody to be able to interact with when visiting your project. Now, to get started, I actually already created a new test where we can see how that works. So inside of Cypress, the first thing we're doing is I'm visiting this demo.appletools.com page. I'm going to do that before each of the tests. Now for the first test, just like I said before, we're going to first get that header where we're going to make sure that it has that text of login form. Now for the second test, we're going to get each of those form input fields and we're going to fill out the username and password. We're even going to get that button to log in and we're going to click it. And then we're finally going to get that header where we're first going to look at the first one, for instance, and we're going to check that it says financial overview, which means that we are successfully on that dashboard page. Now to test that out, I'm going to open up Cypress, where if I click on my test here, login.spec.js, it's going to spin up a new instance of Chrome. And as we can see on the right there, it's already automating our processes, where if we kind of replay this back, we can see as we go through each of these steps that it's first going to load up that page. We can see that inside of the test body that it's going to grab that header and then it's going to check that it says login form. And we can see the green check and that was successful. We can also see that on the login page that it's going to similarly load that demo application, but it's going to go through and it's going to find the username and password and fill it out for us. It's even going to click the login button where we can make sure that once we land on that new page that we're successfully finding that header and that it says financial overview. So that's working great. But say that we come into this application and what happens if we're finding things that are broken that maybe Cypress can't actually see, but somebody like us as a human that we can see visually with our eyes. Now, just to kind of see what this looks like, I'm going to load up a demo page inside of here at index_v2.html, where we set up a demo page to try to just check out what this would actually look like. Now, if we look, we can see that we still get 2 green check marks. If I load up this first test, we can see that over on the right-hand side, we actually have a broken image. We also have a completely different login button here where it's both a different color and it says something different. But when Cypress went through here, all it knows is it was looking for that login form text to make sure that it was on the right page, and that's all it knew to do. We can't really even check that that image was loading without some hacky code that's really going to be fragile or flaky to even maintain. But looking at the second test as well, we can see that it went through, it filled out our information, it still found that button because it had the same ID, and it was still successful because it took us to the dashboard, but it wasn't ever able to see that that login button actually changed because the color changed and the text changed. Now, that of course could be completely intentional from somebody who's changing this page, but it's also possible that maybe somebody was using a component and they refactored that component, and maybe they didn't realize that somebody was also using it on the login page where they're breaking those components throughout the website without even knowing it. Now, what can we do to actually test that and actually look at this page as if we were a person actually viewing it? And to do that, we're going to use Applitools, which Applitools is an automated visual testing platform that allows us to actually put a pair of eyes on all of our tests and all of our pages, where it's going to use visual AI to compare different screenshots or images of our websites and apps to make sure that they're looking and working just as we'd expect them to. What it's going to do is we're going to first set up the SDK inside of our project, and then we're going to be able to upload those images or snapshots up to the Applitools cloud, and they're going to compare it in there to make sure that things are looking right. We can see that even if I'm going to log into my account, if you don't have an Applitools account, you can get one for free right at appletools.com. But since I already have an account, I'm going to log in. And we can see that I already have a bunch of tests, but we're going to run our own tests to kind of see what this looks like. And to do that, I'm going to use the Applitools iCypress SDK, where the cool thing about Applitools is not only does it have a Cypress SDK, it really has an SDK for all the popular testing frameworks. So all your existing tests, you don't need to rewrite everything for a special testing framework. We implement the Eyes SDK right into your existing testing tools. So to start, the first thing we're going to want to do is, just like any other npm package, we're going to be able to install that right into our project. So I'm going to open up my terminal. I'm going to cancel out of the Cypress instance, and I'm going to run yarn add Applitools Eyes Cypress. And just like any other package, that's going to go through and it's going to install the dependency into our project. Now, the second thing we want to do is we need to actually configure the Applitools Eyes SDK plugin and commands into our application. Now, we can see here we have an automated way to do it, but you can also go through and do it manually where we're going to do the plugin, we're going to do the custom commands, but I'm going to use this easy way and simply run npx eyes setup right inside of my terminal. And we can see that Applitools Eyes went in, it added the plugins, it added the commands, it even added TypeScript definitions for those of you who want to use TypeScript. We're not going to get into that, but we support it for those of you who do. But we can see that we're already ready to go and use Applitools Eyes right inside of our project. Now, before we actually write those tests, we want to do one more thing. Now, in order to use Applitools, once you have your account, we also need to specify our API key to make sure that we're communicating with the right account. And to do that, inside of our dashboard, we can head up over to this little person icon at the top right, where we can select the My API Key option. We can grab that API key, and we can head back over to our terminal, where I'm going to type in export Applitools API key. I'm going to set that equal to that API key. And what I'm doing here is I'm exporting this environment variable so that whenever we run a node process, that node process is going to be able to find this environment variable and inject it so that the Applitools Eyes SDK is able to find this variable and use it to communicate up with our individual account. Now, since we have the plugins, the commands, and the API key installed and ready to go, we can actually get started writing our test. So if we go over to the documentation, we can see under the usage tab here that in order to make this work, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to visit the page, just like we're doing in our current tests. But the next thing we're going to do is kind of treat it like we're looking at our own individual eyes or even a camera lens, where the first thing we want to do is we want to open up that lens. And once we do, we want to grab a screenshot or snapshot with it by running eyes check window, just like we would a picture with the camera. And then finally, once we do all of our other interactions, we want to close that camera or close our Applitools Eyes, where then we're going to send up all that information up to the Applitools cloud, where they're going to be able to use that to actually compare our images. So we can actually get started right inside of our code, where because we already added those commands, we can add those right to our existing tests. So the first thing we're going to want to do is run side.eyes open, and we also want to pass in a new configuration object where I'm going to say my app name is financial dashboard, and then I'm going to also run a test name, and I'm going to call that login form page. Next, we want to also take that snapshot. So I'm going to run eyes check window. And then finally, we want to close those eyes. So we're going to run eyes close. And really, that's all we need to do to actually get started for this first test. So let's actually see what happens when we run this. And before I do, I'm going to also revert this back to the original so we can see what happens also when it breaks. Because the first time we send this up, we want to send our baseline, which is going to be the correct image that we're going to use for our application snapshots. So back over inside our terminal, I'm going to run yarn open to spin back up Cypress. But once it loads, we can see that we're going to be able to find our test inside of our project, the login.spec.js, just like before, where we're going to be able to open it up and run it right inside of Cypress. Now, the cool thing is once we have that moving and going, we're going to be able to see this right inside our Applitools Eyes dashboard, just like all these other tests, where we're going to be able to see exactly what that looks like. Now, inside of Cypress, we can click our test again. It's going to open up the instance of Chrome, just like before, where it's going to go through and it's going to load up our tests, and it's going to go through and take those snapshots and interact with the page. Now, we can even see that it's working by looking inside of the Cypress logs, where we can see these options requests in the posts up to the eyes, where Applitools is taking that information and posting it up to Applitools Cloud. And we can even see that it's finished and it's done. And when we go through the different test logs, we can see that it first opened up those eyes, it then checked that window, and then it then closed the window. So let's head over to our Applitools dashboard. I'm going to click reload to bring in that test. It looks like I have a little typo there, But when we look in the screenshot, we can see this is exactly what we were sending up inside of our project. So this is going to be our new baseline, and we can look over at our demo. This is exactly what we want it to look like, and we're going to use this to compare any future tests to make sure that it's both looking and working as expected. Now, as we did before, we have two tests that we actually want to run. The first thing was actually checking the login page, but we also want to check that we can log in. So to do that, we're going to copy and paste this in as another instance where instead of the test name of login form page, I'm going to add it as test logging in. And then I'm also going to add the eyes check window right before we do anything else. So then we're going to go through, we're going to add the username, the password, we're going to click to log in. We're going to check that that financial overview header is still there. We can leave that all in just like before, but then we're going to add another instance of eyes check window. And because we're running eyes check window twice, we want to also add a tag to that. So the first thing, I'm going to add a tag of login page. And then the second one, I'm going to add of dashboard page. That way we're going to be able to distinguish the two within the same flow. And finally, just like our first test, we want to add the eyes close, which means we're going to send that information up to to Applitools Eyes so that they can take that inside of the cloud and actually use it to compare our different snapshots. Now, just like before, when we were running our test with Cypress, we're going to be able to see that it went through and automatically started our test so that we don't have to sit here waiting while it's actually spinning up Cypress and running for the first time. But as it's going through and once it's actually finished, we're going to be able to see that we're going through the tests, and then it's going to do the same thing exactly as it did before, where it's going to open up those eyes, it's going to check our window, and it's going to finally close the window, where it's then going to send that information up to Applitools so that we can compare it with everything else. And just like before, we're going to be able to see all those logs right inside of our terminal to see that it's doing those requests and doing its work to send up our project data. And we can now see that with that second test, that as we go through, it's going to first open up that page, it's going to open up the eyes, it's going to take that snapshot with check window, it's going to go through just like before, it's going to log into that form, it's going to then check and see that it went to that second page, but we're going to take that second snapshot right of that dashboard page and finally close the eyes. Now let's see what that looks like inside of the Applitools dashboard. So when I reload the page, I'm going to click that out and we can see that we have two separate tests. Now the first one, similar to the login form page, we're still going to have that one instance, but this time we have two images. So what we see here on the left is the baseline, where the one on the right is going to be our checkpoint. Now this is green and it's passing because they're still exactly the same. We're still in good shape because our application is working as expected, and that'll automatically pass for us. But we can also see this new test here where we added that test name of test logging in, where if we open that up, we can now see that sequence of events where we now have a baseline that shows somebody actually logging into the application. So this is taking our steps up another level, where not only are we able to kind of check the code that's existing on the page as we're running through with Cypress, but we're able to take this snapshot and look at the page exactly like somebody would be looking at inside of our browser. Now, if we go back over to our test, similar to what we did before, when we tried to test to see what happens when we break the page, let's see what happens when we do the same thing when running this with Applitools. So I'm going to change this to index.v2.html, and I'm going to save it. And just similar to before, what's going to happen this time is Cypress is going to visit this v2 page. It's going to run through the exact same steps as it did before. It's going to open up its eyes, and on the second test, it's going to log in by opening up the eyes, checking the window, both on the login page and on the dashboard page, and finally it's going to close its eyes and send that data all up to the Applitools cloud. Now, if we look back over into our Chrome instance, we can see that that's already done running, where the first one, we can see that we have our failed test, where we have two diffs detected here. Now, we can see here that we have a URL that we can open up right inside of our browser, but I'm going to actually just go back over to my dashboard and hit reload like we did before, but we see this unresolved tag. Now, if we look at these two tests, we can see it's yellow. That means that something happened on the page that we need to test out. If we open up this login page, we can see immediately that we have these pink highlighted areas on the page. If we zoom in, we can see that Applitools was able to capture this difference right on the page, where we can see that we now have a broken image, and it was able to capture that just like you or I would be able to do by going to this page and looking at it ourselves. We can also see that it also captured that difference in the button and the spacing, because the page actually had to shift while that button while the copy of that button changed because of the size of it, but it also changed the color of it. Now, the cool thing is because that remember me button or the checkbox had to actually shift because of the size of the button, we can also click this hide displacement button where it's going to be able to ignore that change because it knows that those pixels or that remember me checkbox is exactly the same on the other side of it. And another cool thing we can do is we can also see what's actually happening and view why something is actually wrong. So if we open up this root cause analysis and click one of our items, we can see that it goes through and it actually shows the difference in the code, where we can see the tag name, it changed from A to button. We can also see that it changed from sign in to login. We can also see that it changed the class name. This is a really great way for us to be able to capture what's actually happening in the differences. Now, the button is a very simple example of that, but imagine if what that looks like as you're scaling up through your application with 100 of different components right inside of your application. We were able to pinpoint exactly what was wrong with our application so we can tell the developer, or if we are the developer, how we can fix that inside of our application. Now, back inside of our other test, we can see the exact same thing, where if we open this up, we can see that it went through, it found the exact same differences as before, and we don't want that because that they were incorrect. We want to fail that back, and we can do that by clicking the thumbs down button. That way we can say that we rejected that change, it wasn't right, and it wasn't working as expected. But we can also see in the second snapshot that we have this text at the top that actually changes due to the different time. Now, I'm sure many of us have dynamic aspects of our page, whether it's something like a timestamp like this, or even if it's somebody's name. What do you do if you have that different kind of information on your page that's going to be constantly changing? Well, what we can also do is we can change what the Applitools eyes is going to look like by adding a little box here. And we're going to say that we want to ignore that, or we can even check that it has a different type of content in there. But for now, let's just use the ignore. And that way, anytime that Applitools goes and sees this box again, it's going to completely ignore that region so that it knows that only check inside of that box, or outside of that box rather, to make sure everything else is working as expected. And as we see here, we have no other changes on this page, so that means we're good to go on that page. So now that we have that region ignored, we can hit thumbs up and we'll be good to go for the future test. And again, for this one, the login form page, we can reject that as well, where we can continue, and that's going to save out our test just like before. So now we can see here, we had our one page that was kind of successful because we ignored that region, but we had that login form page that was actually broken. We can see that this test is now failed because we rejected those changes and we said that we didn't want those to be saved. And we can even see here that it says unsaved. We can go over here and click the save icon, which is a disk if you remember what a floppy disk is. And now let's go back over to our test project, and I'm going to remove that index.v2 HTML again and see what happens when we rerun those tests. Now, if you remember, back inside of our browser, we had two versions of our application. We had one, which was the normal working version, but we also had that index.v2, which had the broken image. So we're going to switch back to the original and see what happens after we failed that other test. And we can see that after Applitools actually goes through, or Cypress goes through rather, it's going to perform those same exact actions, where it's going to go through and capture all the snapshots and send it up to the Applitools cloud. Now let's see what happens inside of the dashboard, where we can head over here and we can see that it's completely fine. It passed. Let's look at the test. We can see that it's back to normal, where it compares back to our original baseline because we failed that last test, and we're in a good stance where we have our working page. We can even go back over to our test logging in test, where if we open it up, we have the login, the images working as expected, the sign in button is working the same. So we're good to go with this, and it passed. And now we're ready to go. Now, the cool thing is with this is not only are we able to test all these flows just like we would inside of Cypress, where we're able to go through each of those different pages, the different interactions, but we're adding another level of testing to this where we're able to capture those visual differences that a testing suite with scripts might not actually be able to see. Because we're using the visual AI, it's capturing it just like a human would be looking at the actual page and be able to capture those differences to make sure everything is right. And the cool thing is, not only does it capture those visual differences, it's going to capture pretty much anything that's broken on the page, because it's able to completely comprehensively look at that page just like somebody would actually be regularly testing it. Okay, so to recap what we achieved here, after reviewing our existing app and Cypress tests, we installed Applitools using the Cypress SDK. We set up some tests, and we finally ran those tests. Like I mentioned before, Applitools supports a huge variety of SDKs, so you can find what you need with pretty much any testing framework. You can check it out at applitools.com/tutorials. And if you want to learn how to go from end to end from design all the way up to a full stack Next.js app, including installing Applitools to run visual testing on Storybook Component Library, check out my free course on YouTube where you can find it at From Design to Dev. And that's it. If you want to learn more about Applitools or chat about the talk of visual testing, you can find me everywhere at Colby Fayok. My DMs are open, and I'll also tweet out a link where you can see some of the stuff you've seen here today. Thanks, everyone.